Hello everyone! Today, I'm going over a budget commander deck that I've built around Tatsunari, Toad Rider, from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. As usual, I've built this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, including our basic lands at 10 cents each, but this won't include costs such as shipping, and also notably for this deck, tokens. Regardless, Tatsunari, Toad Rider is a 3/3 human ninja costing 2 generic and a black to cast, and if you don't control a creature named Keimi and cast an enchantment, you make Keimi, a legendary 3/3 black-green frog creature token that makes each opponent lose a life and yourself gain a life whenever you cast an enchantment. Tatsunari also has the activated ability for 1 generic and either a green or blue mana to make Tatsunari and a target frog you control unblockable except by creatures with flying or reach. So Tatsunari is definitely going to want a ton of enchantments in its deck to ensure that we have ready access to Keimi, as well as a bunch of fuel for Keimi's ability. And given Tatsunari's activated ability points us towards swinging with our commander and a frog, likely Keimi, we're going to include a bunch of aura enchantments in this deck to hopefully get more impact from swinging with our commander and that Froggy Friend, while we're also draining our opponents by casting those enchantments. But secondarily, we'll look to include a few permanents that will stack with Keimi's life-draining ability to make each enchantment that we cast even more impactful. And as you'd expect, we'll be using enchantments for our deck veggies, such as draw and interaction, where it's reasonable to do so. But that's enough of a preamble, let's get into the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp. I'll start with our mana rocks with Talisman of Resilience, Dominance, and Curiosity, each of which tap for a generic or can give us either black-green, black-blue, or green-blue mana respectively at the cost of picking ourselves for 1 life. And Felwar Stone is likely to tap for at least one of our 3 colors, and Arcane Signet will tap for any color we need at the time. Then we have a couple of sorceries with Rampant Growth and Farseek to tutor lands onto the battlefield tapped, the former getting you a basic, and the latter any plains, island, swamp, or mountain land card. Then for enchantments, we have Sanctum Weaver, an enchantment creature mana dork tapping for X mana of any color, with X being the number of enchantments we control. Font of Fertility, which can be sacked to tutor a basic onto the battlefield tapped. And finally for this section, we have Wild Growth and Fertile Ground, which can enchant our lands so that they give an extra mana when tapped for it. The former gives you an extra green, and the latter one of any color we choose. But now let's move on to the cards that we can use to buff our creatures. The only non-enchantment in this chapter is Generous Visitor, a 1-drop creature that lets us put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature whenever we cast an enchantment. Then for power and toughness buffs, Eel Umbra and Boar Umbra give its enchanted creature +1/+1 and +3/+3 respectively, along with Totem Armor for protection, which has the aura be destroyed instead of the enchanted creature if said creature were to be destroyed. Ancestral Mask can really power up a creature in this deck, as its enchanted creature gets +2/+2 for each other enchantment on the battlefield. Strong Back and Well Rested from the Fallout set are also really useful in this deck, the former lowering the cost of equipping or enchanting its enchanted creature by 3 generic, while also giving it +2/+2 for each equipment or aura attached to it, and the latter giving its enchanted creature 2 +1/+1 counters whenever it's untapped, along with giving you 2 life and drawing a card, though this only triggers once per turn. And Bear Umbra gives its enchanted creature +2/+2 and lets you untap all lands you control when that creature attacks, along with providing Totem Armor for some protection. Now moving away from straight power and toughness buffs, Shimmer Wings gives its enchanted creature flying, but being a low cost cast and with the ability to return Shimmering Wings to our hand, provided we have enough blue mana, we can cast this multiple times with Keimi on the board as a way to drain our opponents. Archetype of Imagination gives our creatures flying while preventing our opponent's creatures from having or gaining flying. And Aqueous Form makes its enchanted creature unblockable while letting us scry 1 whenever it attacks. Then for a smidge of protection, Fungal Fortitude gives its enchanted creature +2 power while returning it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control when it dies. And then Shielding Plaques gives something very similar to Hexproof, and Curator's Ward simply gives Hexproof. But that's a decent chunk of enchantments to get Keimi out and start draining our opponents, so let's take a quick look at the cards that we can use to help ramp up that life loss. First up, Marauding Blade Priest and Dina, Soul Steeper, have each opponent lose 1 life whenever we gain life, and Sanguine Bond has a target opponent lose as much life as we gained whenever we gain life. Then Grim Guardian is an enchantment creature that has each opponent lose 1 life whenever it or another enchantment enters the battlefield under our control. And Fate Unraveler is also an enchantment creature, though it deals 1 damage to an opponent whenever they draw a card. Now I have a chunk of cards that themselves can function well in a Tatsunari deck, but didn't have enough representation to make a separate chapter, which I'd like to go over now. First up, Tatsunari's activated ability doesn't require the target frog to be Keimi, So we have a few extra frogs that we can use Tatsunari's ability on. First, Froggy Friend is a 4/4 with trample and haste that, when it deals combat damage to a player, it exiles that many cards from the top of their library, and Froggy Friend gets a +1/+1 counter for each creature card exiled that way, and you gain 1 life for each non-creature card exiled that way. And then Yargle, Glutton of Urborg, and Yargle and Multani are just some extremely large vanilla frogs that we can use Tatsunari to help get through on our opponents. Then for some additional enchantment creatures, Fang of Shigeki is a low drop 1/1 with Death Touch, which can be useful to leave back as a dangerous blocker. Arasta of the Endless Web can help us widen our board as it makes a 1/2 spider creature token with reach whenever an opponent casts an instant or a sorcery spell. Then Destiny Spinner makes our creatures and enchantment spells uncounterable. And it can be used to make a land into an elemental creature with haste, trample, and with power and toughness equal to the number of enchantments we control. And then Nature's Will is an enchantment that, whenever one or more of our creatures deals combat damage to a player, we tap all of that player's lands and untap all of ours. And since we have a ton of auras intended to buff our creatures, Ivy, Gleeful Spell Thief, can get added value from casting those auras, as we can copy any spell that any player casts that targets a single creature and have that copy target Ivy, who also has inbuilt evasion with flying. And finally, since we need to cast enchantments to have Keimi drain our opponents, Shimmerwing Chimera and Riptide Chimera have you bounce an enchantment you control back to your hand at the beginning of your upkeep. Though these two are definitely best when you have a low drop aura on the field that you want to bounce around to various creatures, or another enchantment that won't cost you too much to recast. But with that, let's look to the cards that we can use to help keep a steady supply of spells to cast. We only have 2 non-enchantments in this chapter, with Read the Bones being a sorcery having a scry 2, then draw 2, and then lose 2 life, and Grolnok the Omnivore is another frog that has his mill 3 whenever a frog we control attacks. But then permanent cards being put to our graveyard from our library are instead exiled with croak counters on them, of which we can cast spells and play lands from exile provided they have croak counters on them. Moving on to our enchantments though, Underworld Connections enchants a land, letting us use it to draw by tapping it and paying 1 life. And since Tatsunari gives us access to a reasonable level of evasion, drawing off of combat damage should be more reliable in a deck like this. And as such, we have Keen Sense, which actually draws off of the creature dealing any damage, not just combat damage, but we also have Sixth Sense and Snake Umbra, letting us draw whenever the enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player, with the latter also giving +1/+1 and Totem Armor. Combat Research and Curiosity also let us draw when their enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player, with Combat Research also giving +1/+1 and Ward 1 if the enchanted creature is legendary. And Reconnaissance Mission is a non-aura enchantment that lets us draw whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a player, but that will trigger for each creature that deals combat damage, so you could be drawing multiple cards per combat if you get enough creatures through. Then Eidolon of Blossoms has you draw whenever it or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, and Enchantress's Presence has you draw whenever you cast an enchantment. And finally, Phyrexian Arena has you draw at the beginning of your upkeep, though you lose 1 life in doing so. But with that, let's move on to the cards that we can use to interact with what our opponents are trying to do. I'll start with our instant spells, with Counterspell and Negate for counterspells, though Negate only works for non-creature spells. Infernal Grasp, Doomblade, and Go for the Throat will let us destroy a target creature, though Infernal Grasp costs us 2 life, Doomblade only affects non-black creatures, and Go for the Throat only non-artifact creatures. And then we have Putrefy, which lets you destroy a target artifact or creature. Then we have some auras which we can use to nerf an opponent's creature, such as Frogify, Kasmina's Transmutation, and Eaten by Piranhas, which turn the enchanted creature into a 1/1 and it loses all other abilities. And then Stasis Field makes the enchanted creature a 0/2 with Defender, while losing all other abilities. Doomwake Giant could make it difficult for our opponents to keep low toughness creatures on the board, as whenever it or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, our opponent's creatures get -1/-1 until the end of the turn. But then for actual board wipes, we have Decree of Pain, destroying all creatures and having us draw a card for each creature destroyed that way, but it can be cycled for a Weenie's board wipe. And Extinguish All Hope, which destroys all non-enchantment creatures. But now that we've gone through all of the spells in this deck, let's take a look at our land base. First up are some land tutor lands with Promising Vein, Shire Terrace, and Myriad Landscape, which tap for generic, and the first 2 can be sacked to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, and the last tutoring 2 basics of the same type onto the battlefield tapped. Then for Simic dual tapped lands, we have Hinterland Harbor, which can enter untapped if you control a forest or island, Temple of Mystery, a scry land, and Simic Growth Chamber, a bounce land. For Golgari, we have Woodland Cemetery, entering untapped if we have a swamp or forest, Temple of Malady as a scryland, and Golgari Rot Farm for a bounce land. And for Dimir, we have Drowned Catacombs, which enters untapped if you have an island or a swamp, Temple of Deceit for a scryland, Dimir Aqueduct for a bounce land, and Sunken Hollow, which is a type dual land that can enter untapped if you control 2 or more basic lands, and, since it's typed, it could also be tutored using Farseek. Then Exotic Orchard is extremely likely to tap for at least one of our colors, and Command Tower, Path of Ancestry, and Opulent Palace will tap for any color of mana we need at the time. But aside from those, we'll fill the rest of this deck with 5 islands, 6 swamps, and 7 forests. But now that we've gone through all 100 cards in this deck, let's go over that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently listing around $44.50 at the time of recording, including our basics at 10 cents a piece, but this doesn't include costs like shipping or notably our tokens. But before I close out this video, I'd like to go over a handful of cards you may wish to consider if you'd like to build this deck with a slightly higher budget. To start, we may wish to have a bit more protection for Tatsunari or Keimi so that we're less likely to lose a stack of auras to their removal. So, cards like Alpha Authority, Champion's Helm, and Swiftfoot Boots can be great to add in for some more hexproof. And Swiftfoot's Haste can also be useful, as Keimi will frequently be created the term after we get Tatsunari out for the first time, and will have Summoning Sickness. Crystal Chimes could act as a bit of insurance in case we lose a stack of auras, as we can use it to return all enchantments from our graveyard to our hand. And then Helm of the Gods and Nettlecyst could also act as a large single creature power and toughness buff, as they give the equipped creature +1/+1 for each enchantment you control. Nettlecyst also giving +1/+1 for artifacts, though you'll likely want to make sure that you don't remove too many of our enchantments for artifacts, just to ensure that we have enough Keimi fuel in the deck. But regardless, if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider giving it a like, and maybe drop a sub if you'd like more budget commander decks in your feeds. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.